When we see anomalies in the sky, we often assume they represent visitors from distant planets. This extraterrestrial hypothesis has dominated our cultural understanding of the phenomenon for nearly a century. Mainstream scientific inquiry, including the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, relies on this framework. It assumes that non-human life must follow a materialist path, building physical, nuts-and-bolts spacecraft to traverse the vacuum of space. However, historical data and military tracking reports contain details that contradict this simple model. The recorded behavior of these objects frequently violates the known laws of inertia and propulsion. This chart compares the requirements of a scientific planetary survey against the volume of activity recorded in the UFO database. A biological species mapping a planet requires only a limited number of strategic data points. The thousands of localized encounters documented throughout human history exceed the logical requirements of a scouting mission. Because the biological survey model fails to account for the sheer scale and frequency of these events, we require a different framework to categorize the data. Dr. Jacques Vallée began his investigation from within the scientific establishment itself. Trained as an astronomer and computer scientist, he worked at the Paris Observatory tracking early satellites. After analyzing thousands of cases, Vallée concluded that the data did not fit the aerospace model. He looked past the physical craft to the behavioral patterns, distancing himself from the mainstream ufological community. At the same time, Terence McKenna was approaching the phenomenon from the field of ethnobotany. He specialized in the study of shamanic psychedelic phenomenology, focusing on the consistent reports of entity contact in altered states. Despite their disparate academic backgrounds, both researchers identified the same patterns. They found that sightings in our skies and encounters within the human mind shared a common structure. This convergence led to the interdimensional hypothesis. It posits that we are interacting with a non-human intelligence that originates from dimensions coexisting with our own, manifesting through human consciousness rather than interstellar travel. In his research, Vallée analyzed modern UFO encounters against historical mythology and religious chronicles. He discovered that modern close encounters perfectly mirror ancient Celtic folklore and the medieval accounts of the secret commonwealth. The descriptions of non-human entities, time dilation, and cloud ships from the past are functionally identical to the silver discs and gray humanoids reported today. McKenna found a similar parallel in his work. The entities encountered in DMT states, which he called machine elves, displayed behaviors and communication methods indistinguishable from those described in UFO landing reports. These observations suggest that these different fields are describing the same entities. The specific appearance of the other changes based on the cultural expectations of the observer. The intelligence is a constant presence that masks itself using contemporary symbols, transitioning from the fairies of antiquity to the extraterrestrials of the space age. Close encounters often involve high strangeness, a state where the physics of the environment become dreamlike and irrational. While witnesses are often dismissed because their stories seem absurd, Vallée and McKenna argued that this absurdity is a mechanical feature of the phenomenon. By violating the internal logic of our reality, the phenomenon avoids being codified by our scientific and religious institutions. It remains elusive by design. To explain how physical events behave like dreams, both men utilized the theories of Carl Jung, specifically his work on archetypes and the collective unconscious. This rotating Mobius strip illustrates the concept of the Unus Mundus. It represents a reality where inner space and outer space exist on a single continuous loop, allowing the phenomenon to manifest as a physical object while remaining tied to the human psyche. In this framework, the UFO is a vehicle for gnosis. It is an objective phenomenon designed to interact directly with human awareness. While Vallée and McKenna agreed on the interdimensional nature of the phenomenon, they proposed different models for its ultimate purpose. Vallée's control system hypothesis compares the phenomenon to a cultural thermostat. It introduces new myths to regulate human belief systems and prevent any single ideology from becoming too dominant. This model suggests a non-human intelligence steering human social development through long-term conditioning and symbolic manipulation. McKenna proposed the evolutionary catalyst model. He saw the phenomenon as a planetary overmind that utilizes the UFO image to pull humanity toward an evolutionary singularity. Whether it acts as a cultural regulator or an evolutionary attractor, the phenomenon appears to function as a silent influence on our social trajectory. The interdimensional hypothesis suggests that the boundary we perceive between mind and matter is more permeable than our current physics allows. Historical events, such as the 1917 miracle at Fatima, show how the phenomenon can manifest to thousands of people at once, blending physical environmental effects with deeply personal, psychic experiences. The phenomenon often presents itself with physical characteristics, like mass and inertia, only to dematerialize or violate the laws of physics once the interaction is complete. These patterns suggest that focusing solely on the physical nuts and bolts of the craft may be an incomplete method of investigation. Progress in understanding these anomalies likely requires analyzing the signals that occur where quantum physics and human consciousness intersect. Our current search for non-human intelligence relies heavily on scanning distant stars for radio signals. If the interdimensional model is correct, we are looking for the wrong signals in the wrong place. Computational astrophysics and the study of altered states converged on the same conclusion, that a non-human intelligence appears to be localized within our terrestrial environment. The data suggests the phenomenon represents a localized, multidimensional presence rather than biological visitors from another star system. This other appears to be a co-tenant of our reality, operating in dimensions adjacent to our own and interacting with humanity throughout our history. Before the Industrial Revolution, humanity recorded these interactions as the Secret Commonwealth, or the Celtic Tywaith Teg, the fairy folk. This comparison highlights the anatomical traits shared by the modern gray alien and the traditional Celtic fairy. Both are consistently reported to have short stature, oversized eyes, thin limbs, and a complete lack of hair. The environments they take us to share recurring parallels. Abductees describe the interior of a UFO mothership as a large domed room illuminated by a strange diffused light. In medieval folklore, mortals were taken into hollow hills or fairy mounts, which featured identical cavernous, domed architecture. Witnesses in both eras describe these domains as existing in a perpetual, unnatural twilight, entirely cut off from the sun. While the aesthetic has shifted from organic earth to metallic technology, the architectural and physical archetypes of these domains have remained constant across the centuries. Even the physical side effects of an encounter are mirrored across time. Modern abductees report being paralyzed by an alien light beam, while centuries ago, peasants reported being frozen in place by a fairy's glamour. Then there is the temporal distortion. In modern lore, this is missing time, where a witness experiences hours inside a craft only to discover that days have passed on Earth. This aligns with the ancient folklore trope of a mortal entering a fairy ring for a single night of dancing, only to return to their village and find that decades have elapsed. The phenomenon even leaves similar traces on the landscape. Where modern investigators find scorched crop circles left behind by a saucer, our ancestors found these fairy rings growing in the grass. Advanced physics and magic appear to be two different cultural vocabularies used to describe the same localized manipulation of space-time and human perception. The parallels extend to the most disturbing aspects of the phenomenon, the reports of alien hybridization programs and the non-consensual extraction of human reproductive material. Historically, the primary function of fairies in European folklore was similar: the kidnapping of young mothers and the stealing of human infants. In folklore, a changeling, a fairy replica, was left in place of a stolen human child. This was specifically intended to interbreed with humans to sustain the supernatural race's lineage. The phenomenon has treated humanity as a biological resource for a very long time, simply swapping the medieval justification of changelings for the modern language of genetics. These similarities across vastly different eras point toward the interdimensional hypothesis, a framework suggesting a single, continuous presence coexisting alongside our reality. To understand its changing appearance, we look at human progress. Vallée noticed the phenomenon stays one step ahead of our technology. By mimicking each era's cutting-edge concepts, nature spirits, airships, metallic saucers, it avoids capture while influencing our collective imagination. Vallée proposed this acts as a control system, or a cultural thermostat. By manifesting in ways that are absurd or highly strange, it disrupts our prevailing scientific or religious dogmas, essentially conditioning human social and cultural development over the long term. We are cohabiting with an ancient intelligence that hides behind the folklore and technology of whatever era we happen to be living in. We are not awaiting first contact. We are living through a transgenerational program of cultural regulation. Modern society is currently being bombarded by an explosion of high strangeness. Every day, military pilots, commercial flight crews, and everyday people are reporting encounters with unidentified flying objects and non-human entities. Our strict materialist worldview traps us when trying to explain these events. We are forced to categorize these encounters into two highly restrictive boxes. Either they are literal, nuts and bolts spacecraft flown by biological aliens, or they are mass psychological delusions. The data stubbornly refuses to fit into those boxes. Witnesses routinely describe crafts accelerating instantly without sonic booms, alongside deeply personal experiences of sudden paralysis and telepathic communication. The physical reality and the psychological experience bleed together, leaving modern science entirely helpless. To make sense of this, philosopher and ethnobotanist Terence McKenna argued that we are applying the wrong scientific tools. Instead of asking astrophysicists to solve the mystery, he insisted we must look to the ethnographic data of indigenous cultures. McKenna suggested that the flying saucer isn't a visitor from the stars, but a technological mask for an environment ancient shamans have claimed to navigate for millennia. To understand the saucer, he argued, we first have to understand the maps these cultures left behind. Today, modern people usually stumble into this space by accident, during a UFO encounter, or in clinical settings through the psychiatric study of psychoactive molecules. But ancient cultures approached this space deliberately. McKenna observed that specific psychoactive molecules, specifically tryptamines like DMT and psilocybin, are the essential foundation of the shamanic lifestyle across the globe. The shaman does not consume these plants for recreation. They deploy them as highly advanced chemical technologies, using the molecules to manually alter their brain's receiver frequency. Mechanically, this shifts human consciousness completely outside of three-dimensional space-time. The local, physical world dissolves, dropping the user into a non-local, informational superspace. When you map the characteristics of this psychedelic state, it aligns exactly with the frequency and environment reported in close encounter UFO events. The similarities extend to the inhabitants. Modern experiencers frequently report interacting with gray aliens, giant mantises, and what McKenna called self-transforming machine elves. Strip away the science fiction vocabulary, and these modern beings map perfectly onto the ancient ethnographic descriptions of the shaman's animal familiars, nature spirits, and helpers. Both sets of entities also share a distinct behavioral profile known as the trickster. They communicate through deception, rapid playfulness, and sheer confounding absurdity. This trickster behavior is not a glitch. By confronting the observer with impossible, irrational scenarios, the entities deliberately break down the human ego and strip away rigid societal conditioning. If this hyperdimensional space and its inhabitants are real, we have to ask a functional question. What is the actual purpose of this system? Astrophysicist Jacques Vallée proposed that the UFO phenomenon operates as a control system. He compared it to a cultural thermostat that injects extreme, radical ideas into human society whenever our history builds to a crisis point. McKenna arrived at a complementary theory. He defined this control system as the oversoul or overmind, a guiding intelligence generated by the planet itself. Within this system, the shaman is an active technician. They perform deliberate soul flights into this hyperspace to retrieve data, medical knowledge, and cultural guidance. Their ultimate function is to reach into this eternal space, grab hold of these evolutionary ideas, and inject them into the continuum of human history. Instead of looking out to the stars, this model turns the search inward. The alien intelligence is viewed as a hyperdimensional force intersecting directly with human psychology. A modern UFO encounter occurs when this planetary overmind violently bursts through the oppressive, isolating screen of our materialist society, to confront an individual directly. Because modern people lack the cultural framework to process this dimension, the breakthrough is intensely overwhelming. McKenna concluded that shamans are not primitive relics of human history. Because they have mastered the ability to come and go from this hyperspace, they represent the next evolutionary level of humanity.